Hey guys, welcome. Week 2 of the School of the Hard Knocks course, Classical Conditioning. It's a super powerful principle to understand, and unfortunately, too many people in the industry have a very two-dimensional view of the principle and its capabilities when creating behavior. So, classical conditioning at its root is all developed through Ivan Pavlov's experiment back in the late 1800s. Now, if you haven't heard of Ivan Pavlov or Pavlov's dogs in your life, I'd suggest that you go and look at some videos on his experiment. But in a nutshell, what he was doing was experiments on dogs to test the enzymes in the saliva of dogs. And one day he realized that when one of his technicians went to feed the dogs, there was a response in the dogs. So he thought there was something to that. So what he did was he set up an experiment that every time the dogs were fed, first he would have I think it's called a sonogram, one of those piano things that would go. The misunderstanding or the popular myth about it is always there was a bell that rang before the food, but it was one of these piano things anyway. And he started to pair that every time the dogs got fed. And what he noticed eventually was that the sound that came out of that machine basically took on the power of as if the dogs had already eaten. So they would start to produce saliva purely by hearing that sound. Now, if we are to have a look at that in very basic terms, right? I'm going to bring up a picture here. Let me do this. So this is as simple as it needs to get. You will see lots of diagrams giving you the full scientific outlay on the internet with unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response and neutral stimulus and all this sort of stuff, right? So what we need to understand from a dog training point of view and not a scientific point of view is a unconditioned response, which is essentially you are here. The dog has an unconditioned response to an unconditioned stimulus, right? That means that the response that the dog has when it sees the food, right, happens automatically and is a natural occurrence in the dog. It's a physiological change that occurs within the dog on presentation of the stimulus, which is food. So you can see here, presenting the food to the dog generates salivation. Very, very simple. During the conditioning process, right, we call it the acquisition of a conditioned response, right? So the dog associates the ringing of the bell with the food. This is where the learning takes place or the association starts to take place and has effect. Every time that sound comes before the dog is presented with food, it starts to take on, through classical conditioning, the power of the food, which then leads us to the third step. After conditioning, the conditioned stimulus generates a conditioned response. So this is now the stimulus that brings on the response in the dog that used to happen over here naturally when it was presented with food. So it's pretty basic to understand. We have a signal, right? A very strong function that this signal has, the food being presented. We have a response to that signal through the dog. And what we want to do now is use that to be able to pair that with different signals to be able to generate the same response. And that's where the bell comes in, or whatever sound. Now, in dog training, why is this important? We use this when we create our marker systems. You will be seeing in this email, you'll see in the video that I sent with week 1's recap, the different words that you're going to start using as a marker, which is good girl or good boy, yes, and I think that's about it. But we're going to use clickers as of next week, right? So we're building the clicker or the verbal marker that we're using to be the bell in that picture diagram that I just sent you. Now, what we understand from that is that the point of having the clicker or a verbal marker in dog training, why is that important? First of all, most dog trainers will tell you from their two-dimensional view on classical conditioning that it just lets the dog know when they've done the right thing, right? And yes, kind of that's right, because after that they get food. But the dog doesn't sit there and say, yes, awesome, woohoo, I've just done the right thing. All a dog does is understand that that sound means food. And the power that has is that when we're doing work with the dog, when we're not right next to them in a position to be able to feed them when they're in the correct position, it acts as a bridge. So it gives us more time to get them their reinforcer, but it also acts as the reinforcer within its own right. So the way that the classical conditioning works is that there's a time frame of there's different amounts on this, right? Depending on who's done the studies, but anywhere between 1 to 1.5, 2 seconds, 1 to 2 seconds, we're going to be there or abouts of bridging the pattern together to create the overall sequence. So if we, first of all, are delivering food to the dog, and then reliably 1 to 2 seconds before we deliver the food, we click the clicker, or we say a verbal marker. After enough repetitions, now our clicker or verbal marker has the same power as if the dog has eaten. Physiologically and emotively in the dog, it has that response. And that's what we're putting on tap, the response in the dog. And what we want to do is we want to build it to be a reflexive response, right? So it's an automatic response that the dog doesn't have any control over, right? Because that's the true sign that your dog has been conditioned to something and that it's a conditioned response. Because as I said, with the salivation, the dog doesn't see the food and say, oh, I'm going to salivate now because the food's there. It's an automatic response that happens in the dog that it cannot control. So the same thing must occur when we start to pair a different signal to bring on that response. So if we've got 1.6 seconds or 1 to 2 seconds gap in between each signal, that's basically where it ended for most dog trainers, right? There's a whole new breed of trainers out there, and luckily enough, I subscribe to the new breed of dog training at higher levels, right? Most pet dog trainers will tell you that's Pavlov's experiment. That's classical conditioning. It's to create your marker system, and that's it. Now, if we look further and we look at depth of the power that it truly has, we can start to look at how we can shape behavior and how we can shape emotions in the dog without the dog really having any control over it, right? Because we said it was reflexive response. So let me give you a good example. If you've had dogs in the past and you have gone to take the dog for a walk and you go and grab the lead, some people, it's I put my sneakers on. And what happens in the dog? You start to see a change in their emotion and their behavior, right? They start to get excited. Some dogs start doing zoomies, all the excitement comes out because they know what's happening. That's not because they're sitting there saying she's putting her shoes on, we're going for a walk, I understand. It's more so because the dog knows that putting the shoes on leads to maybe putting the jacket on, which reliably leads to getting the lead out of the cupboard, which reliably leads to putting the lead on the dog, which reliably leads to walking to the door, which reliably leads to opening the door, which reliably leads to going for a walk, right? So this is classical conditioning, and this is the chain of events that can create that response in a dog. So the same thing can happen with negative experience. So if a dog can have a negative impact, right? And usually with the negative side of things, it's more so because of a bigger life event, whether it's in the human or the dog. So you can look at PTSD. Here's a form of classical conditioning, right? The amount of reps that it takes for us to build the sequence or the association will depend on the severity or the value of the outcome, right? So if we're just using food, it might take a lot of repetitions. But say if it was a negative experience in a human case, we had a car crash and then we had PTSD over driving in cars or certain situations with cars, that was one paradigm changing experience because the value was much higher. So if we're going to look at how we can use this naturally occurring sequencing or association building that happens, again, if we were to look at dogs, some people say, oh, I've got a dog and it's so smart. It knows when my husband comes home, or it knows when I'm home, right? If we look at that from its core, it would have been started when you walk through the door and you have a huge event because you're home. How you going, puppy? I love you. So good, right? So this creates an emotive experience in the dog. And what we can say is your dog's probably not sitting there understanding the fact that the car has come home, and I understand cars and all this. But if we take it back to its simple process of signals, meaning signals, we have you walking through the door. The dog has this huge event of you coming home, which it loves. Then after enough repetitions, the dog starts to say, okay, well, reliably before the walk-in and I get cuddles, the door opens. Okay, so now reliably after the door, or before the door opening, I can hear a sound, which is the key going in the door. So that now signals the fact that the door is about to open, which now signals that the person's going to walk through, which now is when I get pats. And what reliably happens a few seconds before that sound in the door, after enough repetitions, they work out, is the keys are pressing the lock button on the car, for example. So now that signifies that what's next is coming is a sound in the door, which is going to open the door, which the person's going to walk through, and so on. It can go back to the roller door opening, the car door shutting, right? So it's not that they understand the concept of cars just driven in the driveway. All they understand is that sound means that this is going to happen, which means that this is going to happen. And it happens because there's been lots of reps and the outcome has been the same every time. So when we look at building our markers and our clickers, if we were to run through that same sequence, yet the event didn't happen at the end, what we would have is called an extinction, right? The response would go extinct because they would work out, okay, well, these signals don't equal that response anymore, right? So the response will die. And why is that important to understand is because when we go through training later, we're not going to be paying the dog every time. This is how we look at proofing behaviors, and that's a whole nother story for a whole nother time. But we'll start to pay the dog only on maybe every third or fifth rep, and then randomly between behaviors, right? Just to keep the battery charged enough that it actually still elicits a response and means something to the dog. We use extinction with negative behaviors when we speak about dogs crying in the crate. If the dog has been crying in the crate or barking at the back door, and reliably that barking has then created success in them getting inside or getting out of the crate, I bark, the bark makes someone come over to the crate. They stand there, they open the crate, I get out of the crate, right? So that is the sequence we're building. If we hold off on doing that sequence, we cut the chain out at its core. The dog is barking, nothing else. The rest of the chain doesn't eventualize. After a while, the dog will go through a process and understand that it doesn't bring on the response that I'm after anymore. Therefore, extinction burst, the dog should stop barking in the crate or stop barking at the back door. So when we look at doing this in terms of teaching behavior, like I've said, we covered the fact that we have the natural response to food, and now we've paired it to a clicker. Now, if we can teach the dog to, first of all, jump into a behavior. So we teach the dog a sit, has a second of stability. We click, which is going to pull the dog out of the sit, and it's going to get its reward. We're setting up a new sequence here, right? And after enough repetitions, what is going to have the power of the clicker, right? What's going to have the power of the clicker? I'll give you a second to think about it, and it might be a bit hard for you to understand at this early point, but it will sink in, trust me. So if we are teaching the dog the signal of sit and the behavior of going into sit, then leads to the click, which then leads to food, essentially the command of sit should take on the power of the rest of the signals in the chain. So again, what I said at the start was that we are building a reflexive response where the dog does not have control over whether they do it or not, right? This is where it becomes three-dimensional and higher level thinking, right? Imagine the power of that, right? Using that to your own abilities in dog training and to your advantage on creating behavior in a dog when you actually understand that concept. That every behavior we teach is a process of association and sequencing, right? There's operant conditioning, which we'll go through next week, which is slightly different, but that will get us to a point before we start adding signals to behavior, which then takes us back to classical conditioning. So we give the command sit, the dog sits within a second or 2 seconds of the sit. Within a second or 2 seconds of the dog sitting, there is a click, which then gets food within a second or 2 seconds, right? The motivation that the dog will have if we build it right for going into that sit will be not in his control and will be very, very fast, right? Because the motivation that the dog will go into a behavior is the motivation that we teach him to come out of a behavior. And again, that's another story for a different time, but we'll cover it all. So I'll give you an example of human conditioning, right? And how classical conditioning can work in humans. A trainer that I like to follow and I do some private coaching with, his name is Pat Stewart. He's from Sydney. He is part of the new breed of dog training. There's a podcast called The Canine Paradigm. If you're not already listening to it, I suggest that you go and listen to it. Now, he used to be a special forces member for the Australian Army. And he said that when they used to go on missions, they fly in the helicopter and they'll be flying somewhere, and two things that he got conditioned to on the helicopter, right? He said 99.9% of the times that we went out in the helicopter, it was a non-event situation. We were flying around and we would actually learn to fall asleep because we needed our sleep, and that's what we'd do. Nothing was going to happen anyway, so we catch up on it. And what started happening was that he got conditioned to the sound of the rotors on the helicopter going around would actually start to make him feel sleepy, because he always had an association. 99.9% of the times I'm in here, I go to sleep, right? And the sound was a sound or a signal that was there that meant nothing, but after enough repetitions, it actually brought on the response in him of being sleepy. Now, the other thing that he got classically conditioned to in this helicopter was if they were going to land somewhere and go into a gunfight, they would get like a 3-minute warning or whatever. And if it was dark, if they were at night and they were blacked out in the helicopter, the guy would have 2 glow sticks, hold up the 2 glow sticks to give the 5-minute warning. And then they got another one at 30 seconds, right? 30 seconds. And I think it was 1 glow stick. And why this is important, right? Because what he would do is going into a known situation where he's probably going to get into a gunfight. It was a natural response in the body to become adrenalized. And what started to happen was, because the time that was linked to the glow stick or the 30-second warning to then reliably going out to a potential gunfight, and that adrenalized response in his body, the signal alone of the 30 seconds would give him that rush of adrenaline. Now, the difference between humans and dogs is the time that we can have between things to still elicit responses and behavior. So we're a bit more superior in that regard, right? So he said that, a few years ago, he's been 10 years out of the army or thereabouts. He went to like a festival in Sydney with his son and his mate who was in the army, and his son and wife, whatever. They were out late and they were driving home. And as they pulled onto his street, his army buddy turned around, being a bit of a smartass, because they were almost at his home, and he had a glow stick from the festival, and he was like 30 seconds, right? Giving him 30 seconds until he's home. But what had happened was he had a rush of adrenaline, right? Because his only experience with that glow stick and that signal was reliably consistent that he was going into a gunfight, right? So this is the power of it. He couldn't control the response, but that's the response that his body gave. So it's super important to understand this. And what I want you guys to think about for the next few days until we catch up on Saturday is think of different areas of your life where you've been classically conditioned to do something. And we're going to talk about this when we catch up on Saturday. A few different examples of classical conditioning where it's happened in your own life. Because once we understand and we can see it within our own life, we can then start to see it and better use it when we're using dog training as well, right? So it doesn't have to be so much behavior-based. It could be more emotion-based. But whatever, have a think about it, jot down some ideas, and come to class and we'll have a chat about it. If there is any questions on this, guys, please feel free to send it in to the group. I'll answer all the questions there by video, and we'll go from there. But I hope you enjoyed the talk. There's plenty more to come. I thank you guys again for having faith in me and trusting me to take you on this journey. You're definitely not going to regret it. You're going to get great results, and we're going to build awesome dogs. So I appreciate it. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you on Saturday.